I never thought a billionaire would cry on my shoulder. But there he was, owner of mansions across continents, a fleet of jets, and enough money to buy a small country, breaking down because what he truly craved was something his billions couldn't buy: authentic connection. I never imagined my life would intersect with someone who had everything, at least on paper. My name's Alex, and 3 years ago, I was just scraping by as a part-time barista, an aspiring writer, in a city that seemed determined to push me out with its rising costs. I lived in a cramped studio apartment with noisy pipes and temperamental heating. My morning alarm was the construction crew working on the luxury condos across the street, buildings I knew I'd never set foot in. That's what makes the story so unlikely. See that construction project? It belonged to him. Richard Dalton, a name that graced magazine covers and business school case studies. The man who turned a small tech startup into a global empire before he turned 40. I remember the first time I saw him in person. Custom Italian suit that probably cost more than my annual rent, surrounded by nodding executives hanging on his every word. He looked like he belonged to a different species than me. The contrast between our worlds was almost comical. While I counted pennies for my weekly groceries, he was deciding which of his 14 homes to fly to on his private jet. When my ancient laptop died, I had to pick up extra shifts for months to replace it. Meanwhile, he was investing millions in quantum computing ventures without blinking. We moved through the same city, but occupied completely different realities. But here's the question that haunts me now, whenever I think about Richard and everything that happened. What does happiness really mean when you can have everything? Because despite all his wealth, the kind of money that most of us can only dream about, Richard was carrying around a poverty that no bank account could fix. And that's really what this story is about. So stay with me for the next half hour, and I'll show you what wealth really looks like, beyond the mansions and jets. If you've ever wondered if money buys happiness, this story will change your perspective forever. Because the truth I discovered, through my unlikely friendship with one of the world's richest men, wasn't what I expected. And it might just change how you think about success, connection, and what makes a life worth living. People often ask how someone like me ended up in Richard's orbit. It wasn't through networking events or industry connections. It was through a spilled coffee, specifically his coffee all over my shirt. I was working the morning rush at Grounded, this little cafe tucked between towering office buildings. Richard walked in without the usual entourage, no security, no assistants, just a man in a simple grey sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent. When he bumped into me, sending hot coffee cascading down my uniform, I expected the worst. Instead, he looked genuinely mortified. "I'm so sorry," he said, with an expression of such authentic concern that I was taken aback. He insisted on paying for dry cleaning and handed me his personal card, not an assistant's, his actual number. I remember thinking it was probably fake, but I called anyway, mostly out of curiosity. To my shock, he answered. Even more surprising was his invitation to meet for coffee. "A replacement for the one I ruined," he said. That's how I found myself sitting across from one of the wealthiest men in the country at a tiny table in the same cafe where I worked shifts. What struck me that day wasn't his wealth or status, but how carefully he listened. In a world where he was constantly surrounded by yes men, he seemed hungry for someone who would just talk to him normally. Our conversation lasted 3 hours. He asked about my writing, my dreams, my struggles, and not in that superficial way people ask when they're just being polite. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered details. As weeks passed and our coffee meetings became regular, I began to see glimpses behind the polished public image, like how he would stare longingly at families laughing together at nearby tables, or how he would flinch slightly whenever someone approached asking for a photo, always obliging with a practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. "You know what's strange, Alex?" he said to me one rainy afternoon. Most people think they want to be in a room where everyone knows their name, but what they really want is to be in a room where someone knows their heart. That was the moment I realized our unexpected friendship wasn't just coincidence. It was filling a void for both of us. He needed someone who saw him as a person, not a portfolio, and I was learning that success had dimensions I'd never considered. The first time Richard invited me to his penthouse, I felt like an imposter. The private elevator required a special keycard and opened directly into a foyer larger than my entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, making it look like a miniature toy set from that height. Original artwork hung on walls, sculptures stood in corners, pieces I recognized from museums, except these weren't replicas. "It's a bit much, isn't it?" Richard said, noticing my wide eyes. There was something almost apologetic in his tone. As we walked through endless rooms, a home theater, a gym, multiple guest suites that had never hosted guests, I realized something unsettling. Despite all the splendor, there were no personal touches, no family photos, no mementos, nothing that told you who actually lived here. It was like a museum dedicated to success, but empty of life. "I have 13 other properties just like this," he confessed over dinner prepared by his personal chef. "Sometimes I forget which one I'm in when I wake up." He wasn't joking. He spoke about flying to his villa in Monaco or his mountain retreat in Aspen with the same enthusiasm someone might discuss going to the grocery store. Places that would be dream destinations for most were just empty boxes to him. Spaces filled with expensive things but void of meaning. One evening, during a charity gala I attended as Richard's +1, I witnessed the bizarre reality of his social life. People orbited around him, laughing too hard at his mild jokes, agreeing enthusiastically with every opinion. But their eyes gave them away. They weren't looking at him, but at what he represented: opportunity, connections, money. "Watch what happens when I walk away," he whispered, excusing himself to make a call. Within seconds, the crowd dispersed, their attention immediately redirected to the next potential benefactor. When he returned, they flocked back instantly, performance resuming without missing a beat. "How do you know who's genuine?" I asked him later that night. "That's the thing, Alex, I don't." His voice carried a heaviness I'd never heard before. Every relationship comes with a question mark. Every compliment might be calculated. Even my oldest friends. I can never be completely sure they're not just staying close because of what I can do for them. The price of his empire wasn't just measured in billions invested. It was paid in a currency far more precious: trust. The higher he climbed, the more suspicious he became of everyone's motives, including, sometimes, mine. It was a loneliness so specific to extreme wealth that most people would never understand it. An invisible prison with golden bars. It was a Tuesday night when everything changed between us. Richard had invited me to his Malibu beach house, a modernist masterpiece perched on a cliff with unobstructed ocean views. The kind of place you see in architectural magazines. But when I arrived, I found him sitting alone on the deck in near darkness, an untouched glass of scotch in his hand. Something was different. The carefully maintained facade had cracked. "Do you know what my earliest memory is?" he asked without turning around. "Watching my father leave for work before sunrise and return after I was asleep. He built a fortune, and I barely knew him." Richard's voice was hollow as he described growing up with everything money could buy and nothing it couldn't. I swore I'd be different, that my success wouldn't cost me what mattered, and yet here I am, just like him. As the waves crashed below us, Richard did something I never expected. He cried, not dramatic sobs, but quiet tears that seemed to carry the weight of decades. This titan of industry, this man whose decisions impacted global markets, suddenly looked small and profoundly human. "I'm so tired, Alex," he whispered. "Tired of rooms full of people where I feel completely alone. Tired of wondering if my girlfriends dated my bank account or me. Tired of friends who conveniently need investment advice or startup capital. He described a particularly painful memory of overhearing his last girlfriend at a party, laughing about how she was taking the billionaire for all he's worth. It had ended their relationship instantly, but the wound clearly hadn't healed. You know what's truly ironic? Richard continued, finally looking at me. The higher I climbed, the less freedom I felt. Every decision scrutinized by boards and shareholders. Every move analyzed by the media. The empire became my prison, and I'm the one who built it. He gestured toward the sprawling house behind us. 14 properties, and not one feels like home. Just showcases for a life I'm not actually living. What struck me most was realizing that Richard's confession wasn't about ingratitude for his wealth. It was about recognition of what he'd sacrificed to obtain it, and questioning whether the trade had been worth it. Time, authenticity, the ability to trust, the luxury of ordinary moments. The most honest relationship in my life right now is with you, he admitted, because you're the only person who doesn't need anything from me. Do you know how rare that is? To have someone see you, not what you can provide? I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to remind him that millions would trade places with him in a heartbeat. But looking at him, this powerful man reduced to his essential loneliness, I understood a truth about wealth I'd never considered. Having everything sometimes means appreciating nothing. I keep wondering, he said finally, staring out at the darkness where the ocean met the sky. If I died tomorrow, who would truly mourn me? Not my money, not my connections, but me. The question hung between us, heavier than any business decision he'd ever faced. That night changed our friendship. The pretense was gone. Richard wasn't a billionaire confiding in a barista anymore. He was just a man confronting the emptiness his success had carved out inside him. And I wasn't impressed by his wealth anymore. I was concerned for his heart. Something shifted as we sat in silence watching the waves. A door opened to something more authentic than either of us had anticipated when our paths first crossed. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Like any journey worth taking, Richard's rediscovery of what truly mattered came in small steps, awkward moments, and occasional backsliding. After that night in Malibu, something fundamental had shifted. He began asking questions I never expected. How do you maintain friendships without an agenda? What do normal people do on weekends? When was the last time I felt genuinely happy? Our coffee meetings evolved. Sometimes we'd abandon the upscale cafes he preferred for the noisy diner near my apartment. He'd leave his security detail behind, dress in jeans and a plain t-shirt, and experience what it meant to be anonymous. I watched his discomfort gradually transform into relief as he realized no one was watching, photographing, or approaching him. I forgot what this feels like, he admitted one day as we walked through a crowded farmer's market. Just being a person. He seemed fascinated by the ordinary exchanges around us. The vendor who remembered a customer's name, friends laughing over shared memories, couples debating dinner plans. Simple human connections he'd been isolated from for decades. The most profound moment came when Richard decided to volunteer. Not by writing huge checks or having his foundation handle it, but by physically showing up at a local shelter to serve meals. I went with him that first day, watching as he nervously approached the volunteer coordinator who had no idea who he was. For 4 hours, he stood beside me, ladling soup, making awkward but increasingly genuine conversation with homeless individuals who cared nothing about his net worth. That was the most exhausting day I've had in years, he confessed afterward, and the most meaningful. The simple act of being valued for his labor, rather than his assets, had touched something long dormant in him. He returned every week after that. Our worlds began to blend in unexpected ways. He joined my friends for trivia nights where his encyclopedic business knowledge proved useless against questions about pop culture. I watched him struggle to connect at first, overthinking every interaction. But gradually, he learned to just be present, to listen without calculating. to share without performing, to experience joy without analyzing its ROI. "The irony isn't lost on me," he said one evening as we watched the sunset from a public park bench. "I spent my life accumulating things that were supposed to make me happy, but the moments that actually do involve giving things away, my time, my attention, my presence." He looked genuinely at peace for the first time since I'd known him. Maybe wealth isn't what I thought it was. The billionaire was learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, what no financial advisor had ever taught him: that the currency of connection operates on different principles than the markets he had mastered. And I was learning that happiness isn't found at either extreme of the economic spectrum. It lives in the authenticity of our bonds with others. 3 years have passed since that spilled coffee changed both our lives. Richard isn't the same man he was when we met. He sold 8 of his properties, keeping only the ones that actually meant something to him. He stepped back from daily operations at his company to focus on a foundation that doesn't just write checks, but creates pathways for personal connection in underserved communities. Most importantly, he learned to measure wealth differently. Last month, I visited him at what he now calls his real home, not the biggest or most impressive property he owns, but the one where he's built genuine memories. Photos line the walls now. Evidence of a life being lived, not just financed. People drop by without appointments or agendas. There's laughter that isn't calibrated to his status. Is Richard still wealthy beyond most people's wildest dreams? Absolutely. The difference is that he no longer confuses his net worth with his value as a human being. And that has made all the difference. The billions haven't disappeared, but they've found their proper place in his hierarchy of importance. Now it's your turn. Take a moment today to measure your wealth, not by what's in your bank account, but by who truly knows your heart. Share this video with someone whose love makes you feel like a billionaire. Because at the end of our lives, that's the only currency that matters.